The signal she gave you wasn't something new that appeared. It was something familiar that disappeared, and by the time you noticed the silence, it had likely already been telling you something for days. There's a real-time welfare monitor running in your backyard every single day, built entirely out of sound, and the moment it goes quiet is precisely when it deserves the most attention, not the least. If you've been treating the silence as just a quieter stretch, wait until you see why vocal change tends to arrive before anything visible does, and what the silence can tell you depending on when it started and who it's affecting. So what is her body actually doing when it withdraws the vocalizations that used to be there? How do you tell the difference between a silence that's seasonal, a silence that's social, and a silence that means something physical is wrong? And what does it mean when her voice starts coming back? When your chicken stops singing, do you actually know what her silence is trying to tell you? Yes, it's easy to miss at first, but behind that absence of sound, there's something most backyard keepers completely overlook. It's one of the most telling behavioral shifts a hen can show, and unlike most signals, this one doesn't announce itself. It simply isn't there anymore, and if you've been waiting to see something change before paying attention, which most people do, you've already been given the signal. It just came in a form you weren't listening for. Let's start with what that silence actually means. 1. It was never just quiet. Most people assume it's simple. Some days chickens are vocal, some days they're not. She's just having a quieter stretch. But here's the thing. Vocal behavior in a socially bonded, physically healthy hen is not random. It follows a pattern, tied to her daily routine, her social engagement with the flock, her internal state, and the environment around her. A hen who greets the morning with a consistent set of calls, who vocalizes during foraging, who checks in with flock mates through contact calls throughout the day, has a vocal baseline that's as individual and consistent as her physical appearance. Because silence in a social species is never neutral. In a prey animal whose communication is tied directly to flock cohesion, predator detection, and social bonding, the withdrawal of vocalization is a withdrawal from the social functions that vocalization serves. When a hen who has been consistently vocal goes quiet, her silence occupies the same communicative space her calls used to fill, just with the opposite signal. Research in poultry welfare science has identified reduced vocalization as one of the earliest and most sensitive behavioral indicators of a change in a hen's internal state, often appearing before other visible signs of illness, stress, or social disruption become apparent. Her silence isn't an absence of information, it's the information, arriving ahead of everything else. And by the way, if the silence has been accompanied by even one other small change you've noticed but haven't been sure what to make of, those two things together are almost certainly connected. We'll cover exactly how to read that combination before the end. 2. Vocal behavior is a direct readout of her internal state. Have you ever noticed how different your hen sounds on a calm morning in the yard compared to a day when something's disrupted the flock? That variation isn't coincidence. Vocalization in chickens is directly coupled to physiological and emotional state in ways that make it one of the more reliable windows into what's actually happening inside her. Here's what most people don't realize. The neural systems governing vocalization in birds are tightly linked to the same systems governing stress response, social motivation, and physical well-being. When those systems are running normally, the vocal output that follows is normal. When something disrupts those underlying systems, whether it's elevated stress hormones, pain, illness, or social instability, the disruption shows up in vocal behavior almost immediately. Studies in applied poultry science have documented that measurable changes in vocalization rate, frequency, and type correlate with changes in welfare state in domestic hens, with vocal suppression specifically associated with elevated corticosterone, the primary avian stress hormone, and with the early stages of illness before other clinical signs are visible. Your hen singing, that daily soundtrack you may have stopped consciously noticing, has been functioning as a real-time welfare monitor all along. Its absence is the alarm. 3. Social silence is different from solitary silence. Is she quiet in a way that seems general and withdrawn, or specifically quiet around the flock while still being more responsive when you approach her individually? That distinction points toward different underlying causes. A hen who goes quiet specifically in flock context but retains some responsiveness when approached one-on-one may be dealing primarily with a social stressor rather than a physical one. Changes in flock composition, the loss of a bonded companion, the introduction of new birds, or a shift in the pecking order can all produce a form of social withdrawal that shows up first in reduced participation in the group's vocal life. The contact calls, the foraging sounds, the low-level chatter that keeps a flock acoustically connected during the day. Research into social stress and domestic fowl has found that hens who have experienced a disruption to their primary social bonds within the flock show measurable reduction in affiliative vocalizations directed at flock members, even in the absence of physical illness, as their social motivation shifts in response to the changed social landscape. If her silence feels more like withdrawal from the group than from life generally, the social environment is worth examining as a primary rather than secondary possibility. And if this is shifting how you're listening to your flock's daily sounds, hit that like and subscribe. It helps us reach more keepers who want to understand what their birds are actually communicating through behavior like this. 4. Physical illness announces itself in sound before it shows in the body. Have you noticed the silence, but not yet seen anything else you definitively call a symptom? That sequence, vocal change before visible physical change, is more common than most keepers expect, and it's one of the most practically important things to understand about chicken health. Chickens, as prey animals, are wired to suppress visible signs of vulnerability for as long as possible. Pain, illness, and physiological disruption are masked behaviorally in ways that can make a sick hen appear outwardly normal well into the progression of an illness. To the degree that her feathers are smooth, her eyes appear open, and her body posture hasn't yet collapsed into the unmistakable hunched, fluff sickness posture that most keepers know to look for. But vocal behavior is harder to mask. The suppression of vocalization in an ill bird appears to happen earlier and more automatically than the suppression of posture or movement, because the systems driving social vocal output are among the first to be deprioritized when the body is directing resources toward managing an internal problem. Veterinary poultry literature consistently notes that a change in a hen's vocalization pattern, including unusual quietness, is worth treating as an early clinical indicator rather than waiting for more visible physical symptoms to develop before investigating further. If she's gone quiet and you can't identify an obvious social or environmental cause, her physical state is the next thing to look at closely, not the last. 5. Seasonal and environmental triggers produce a specific pattern of silence. Has the silence arrived alongside a change in season, a run of unusually hot or cold weather, or a significant shift in daylight hours? Environmental triggers produce vocal changes too, but they tend to follow a recognizable pattern that's worth distinguishing from other causes. Chickens are acutely sensitive to photoperiod changes, the shifting ratio of light to dark across seasons, which directly influences hormonal regulation and through that behavioral patterns including vocalization. Reduced daylight in late fall and winter is associated with measurable changes in activity level, foraging behavior, and social engagement in domestic hens, including reduced vocalization, as the hormonal environment that drives active, engaged behavior shifts with the light cycle. Research into seasonal behavioral variation in poultry has found that reduced light exposure produces a broad behavioral quieting that can look superficially similar to stress-related or illness-related vocal suppression, but is typically more gradual in onset, flock-wide rather than individual, and accompanied by predictable shifts in other behaviors like reduced laying and more time spent roosting. If the silence arrives slowly, affects multiple birds equally, and coincides with changing seasons, the environmental explanation is likely doing most of the work. If it arrives suddenly, affects one specific hen, and doesn't align with any obvious seasonal shift, the other explanations deserve more attention. 6. The return of her voice tells you just as much as its disappearance. Have you ever had a hen go quiet for a period and then gradually become vocal again, almost as if warming back up? The pattern and pace of that return carry their own information. A hen recovering from a manageable stressor, a molt, a brief illness, a social disruption that's been resolved, tends to resume her vocal baseline gradually, with increasing frequency and variety of calls as her condition improves. This gradual return is a positive indicator, a readout of a system coming back online at a pace consistent with actual recovery. A hen who swings abruptly from silence back to very loud, persistent, or atypical vocalization without a gradual transition period is worth watching closely. Sudden vocal escalation following a period of silence can sometimes indicate a different kind of distress than the original quietness, particularly if it's paired with restlessness, repeated circling, or straining behavior. In those cases, the return of sound isn't simply the return of well-being. It's a shift in what her body is communicating, and it deserves the same attention as the silence that preceded it. 7. How to tell which silence you're dealing with. So when you stand at the edge of your yard and notice that something is missing from the usual soundtrack of your flock, how do you actually read what you're hearing? This is the part that matters most, and it's where paying attention to everything together, rather than any single sign in isolation, becomes essential. Start with scope. Is it one hen who's gone quiet, or has the whole flock become more subdued? Flock-wide quieting points toward environmental or predator-related causes. Individual silence points toward that specific hen. Then move to timing. Did the silence appear suddenly, overnight, or within a day, or has it crept in gradually over a week or more? Sudden onset suggests a more acute cause. Gradual onset suggests something building over time, whether physical, social, or seasonal. Then look at what else is or isn't happening alongside it. Is she eating, drinking, maintaining her position in the flock? Does her body posture look normal or subtly off? A hen who is quiet but otherwise maintaining all her normal behaviors is in a different situation from a hen who is quiet and also eating less, or quiet and also positioned at the edge of the flock rather than integrated within it. Research in poultry welfare assessment consistently emphasizes that behavioral changes carry the most diagnostic value when evaluated as part of a pattern rather than individually, because no single sign is unambiguous on its own. The silence is what got your attention. Everything else is how you figure out what it's actually saying. She sang every day for long enough that you stopped consciously hearing it. Now the silence is where the song used to be, and it's been asking you the same question every day since it arrived. Are you listening yet?